Right on the money. Good morning. It's good to see all of you today. Everybody has a handout, pretty much. If not, there's a few floating around, or you can share. We'll manage one way or the other. It's a delight to be with you again and to spend a little time thinking about the history of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod at its 175th anniversary, and to spend a little time really reflecting. Boy, Pastor's sermon was excellent this morning on what God has done and his promises to us. So let's open with a word of prayer, and then we'll dig right in. Heavenly Father, we give thanks to you for calling us to faith and sustaining us in that faith in Christ our Lord, and then showing to us the way you continue to be faithful to your church throughout the ages. As we focus on the history of our Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, continue to teach us and to help us be thankful for your blessings, and to help us be bold and courageous as we share the gospel of Christ in our particular circumstances, so that more and more people may come to know of the salvation he has won for them through his suffering, death, and resurrection. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. So, last week, we went roaring through a couple hundred years worth of history, and I said I promised this week it would be a little more reasonable pace, and then I tried to summarize everything, and I couldn't. So I gave you one sheet, you notice, which is really totally false, because I have a whole pile of slides that are hidden in the PowerPoint, but we'll manage. We'll get through one way or the other. There's so many stories in all of this, and really that's one of the things I find most compelling about the history of our church body. You know, we talked last week about some of the early Lutherans coming along, the Danes in 1619, and the Swedes in 1638, and the Dutch somewhere in that range, 1624 to 1644, and finally the Germans at the end of the 1600s. And then the Germans really took over in a lot of ways in the 1700s. And there's this spike, if you will, in growth in Lutheran churches that occurs before the American Revolution. So there's just a few scattered congregations and pastors at about the year 1700. And then by the time you get to the American Revolution, 1776, there's over 300, and it's growing, it's continuing to grow. Now the growth comes from what? Immigration. Germans especially, but there's some Swedes and Norwegians and Finns thrown in to keep things exotic, right? But mostly Germans coming in and starting congregations, especially in the area around Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, what we would call the middle colonies. Not so many up in New England, almost none, frankly. Not a whole lot down in the South, a couple of isolated places like Charleston, South Carolina, Savannah, Georgia, and then a little later up around Columbia, South Carolina, and then Hickory, North Carolina, interestingly enough. There's still a lot of Lutherans around Hickory, North Carolina. If you go to Catawba County, there's Lutherans all over the place. But figure that one out. I can't. But, well, actually I can. But nevertheless, we don't have time to talk about it. but these kind of isolated places in the southern, what become the southern states. But Pennsylvania, Maryland, New Jersey, that's kind of Lutheran central, if you will. And what happens initially is that folks start moving west out of Philadelphia, and they bump up against the Appalachian Mountains, and they start to move down the Appalachian Range. They don't go farther west initially, towards western Pennsylvania or Ohio or what becomes Indiana. And the reason for that is what? Well, King George III, in 1763, at the end of the 7 Years' War, what we call the French and Indian War, he draws what's called the Proclamation Line, right? And it says, you can go this far west and no farther. And so that's part of the reason these good law-abiding Lutherans kind of slide down south as they head west. But of course, it's America, right? So there's always somebody who says, what? Who's going to stop me? Right? Come on, I can't go there. Come and get me, right? And they push west that way. And those will be the first Lutheran settlers into the West. They'll kind of come out of Baltimore, Philadelphia, through what's Cumberland, Maryland, and then the panhandle of Maryland into the West, and finally into Ohio and Indiana a little bit later on. But what that then means is, as they're making these moves, they're having entirely new experiences, because they're coming from an area that is settled, and in which, as we talked about, the relationship between the church and the state is like hand in glove, right? And now they're in America, and the church is independent of the state. So how do you organize yourself? How do you operate as a local congregation when you no longer have support from the state? And support meant what? Money. You paid your church tax as a citizen, and then the government distributed that tax money to the church, and the church ruled through typically a consistory, again, as we talked about last week. A small group of folks with government authority actually made determinations about where the churches would be, where they'd be built, who the pastor would be, everything. But now here you are in America, and there's none of that. So what do? Exactly. That's an excellent answer. You don't know. You just don't have any idea. This is a completely new experience for these folks. That's my point. And so they have to figure it out as they're going along. And it is tremendously challenging. I have terrific respect for these folks as they make these adjustments to a new situation. Then, as they go west, as I said, they kind of first slide down the Appalachian Range, or they come up over the Appalachians from the southern colonies into new states immediately following the Revolutionary War, new states like Kentucky and Tennessee. Those are called the Southwest. The old Southwest was Kentucky and Tennessee. And as you look at this map, which is from 1850, it shows where there are Lutheran congregations. And what do you note as you look at this map? There are very few Lutheran congregations in Kentucky and Tennessee. Very few. Now, a question. Does that mean no Lutherans went west into this area? And the simple answer is no, they did. Plenty of them went west. But what happened? With no pastors and no congregations, they ended up going into either other traditions, especially Baptist and Methodist, German-speaking Baptists and Methodists, or they left the church altogether. So that by the year 1800, this will kind of probably blow your mind, the hotbed of atheism and unbelief and lack of church membership and attendance in the new American nation was Kentucky. Now, I don't think of Kentucky that way today, and I doubt you do either. Something changed, and it would be, maybe we should do another Bible class on what changed. But I'm already behind today because I'm telling this story. Charles knows this happens every time in class, and he goes on, and he never shuts up. All right. So pushing on. This is pre-1825. This model here. In 1825, everything changes. Why? I'll show you the picture of it. Oops, we'll come back to that in a second. Instead of going south after 1825, everything goes north. Why? And I keep saying 1825 very purposefully. Amy's not here with me today. She's up in upstate New York visiting her parents. And she will be staying, her parents' house is less than a half a mile from the Erie Canal. And when the Erie Canal opens up in 1825, people start moving north. And as they move north, they move into other parts of already existing states. And that's our previous slide. I got a little ahead of myself. How many of you are Southerners? And I mean by that Southern Indiana. I was born in Chicago. I'm a Chicagoan. I was actually born in the city of Chicago. And we thought everything south of Interstate 80 was the South. Right? And I lived with that for a long time, but then I came to Fort Wayne to be a student at the seminary, and we're south of I-80, and I didn't want to be a Southerner, so I moved the line to I-70, right? And everything south of I-70 is the South. Then I was a pastor in Nashville, Tennessee, and I had to move the line down to I-40, right? But anyway, I digress. The South, or better yet, the different character of Southern Indiana, Southern Ohio, Southern Illinois. Any Southern Illinoisers in here? Good, because you'd be angry at me, we Chicagoans already. Of course, everybody's angry at Chicagoans all the time. Southern Illinois is a different world than Northern Illinois. Southern Indiana has a different feel to it than Northern Indiana. And the reason is the Erie Canal. The settlement that led to statehood in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. Ohio becomes a state in 1803, Indiana 1816, Illinois 1818. The vast majority of the population at statehood is in the southern part of the state, and that's what this map shows. Those are the platted areas. What's up north? In Indiana. That's a hint. Indians, right? Treaty of Greenville, 1795 says all this is going to, west of the line in Ohio and north is all going to be reserved for the Native American tribes. But that gives way in the first part of the 1800s, and then when the canal opens up, there's a way west, and there is available land, and most importantly for the German immigrants who come in, it's cheap. I'm a German, and I'm also Scottish, so I get it doubly here. So I am frugal. She has to find cheap. I'm frugal. So the German immigrants start coming in. Now, German immigration stops, but I shouldn't say stops, but declines dramatically with the opening of the Revolutionary War. What had been a regular, steady flow of folks coming in really cuts off. And the German immigrants who come during the war are what? Mercenary soldiers, Hessians, who end up joining the Lutheran churches after the war. Many stay and join. But it's not until about the year 1830 that immigration picks back up. And when it picks back up, there's a flood of immigrants that comes into America. Just as the Erie Canal is opening and lands for settlement in northern Ohio, northern Indiana, northern Illinois open up. And also then new states come into existence, right? So think, for example, of places where there's lots of Lutherans today. Michigan. Statehood is achieved in 1837. Here, Indiana's 1816, Michigan's 1837. Wisconsin, 1848, statehood. Minnesota, 1857. So much later, settlement there. and it's driven by immigration, not just German, but Scandinavian as well, and lots of Lutherans coming in. So that in the years between 1840 and 1875, at least 58 Lutheran church bodies, not congregations, church bodies are formed. 58 in a 35-year period. Why so many? Well, several things. One is geography. Think of our own name. We're the Missouri Synod, right? But I told you last week our official name originally was the German Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Missouri, Ohio, and other states. Get lazy at the end, right? And a bunch of others. And the majority of the congregations that are forming in 1847 were from Indiana, and I'm still irritated about that. We should be called the Indiana Synod, but anyway. So you have the geographical reality that's there. You have also just the reality of trying to travel. It's hard to get around, right? So synods tend to be very local and very small. When we're formed, there are 12 pastors, 14 or 16 congregations that are part of the formation, with about 4,000 members. Tiny synod. Tiny, tiny, tiny. There's more Lutherans than that in Fort Wayne today than there were in the entire Missouri Synod back in 1847. And then finally, also, confessional identity. And we talked a little bit about that last week with Samuel Simon Schmucker. There's a different idea afloat about what Lutheranism is. So it makes for an incredibly dynamic situation and really interesting to me. You know how history can be so boring most of the time when it's just names and dates and facts, which I'm doing constantly as you hear me. But there's stories that are bound up with all this, and that's the interesting part. And some of you shared a few of your family stories with me alongside of this, and to me, it's just utterly fascinating to see how this could have happened. Because, keep in mind, what we're looking back at now, and what we know, historically speaking, didn't have to be the case as things were developing. People had to make decisions, choices about what it was they were going to do, who they were going to affiliate with, whether they should be part of an existing Lutheran church body, whether they should create a new one. All of this stuff, all this new stuff, they have to decide. And they do so, again, completely independent of any outside authority. The state can't tell them what to do. So they can do whatever they want. I always joke about it this way, Charles remembers this too, that if you're unhappy with your church, what do? You go start a new one, right? And if you're unhappy with your church body, what do? You go start a new one. So just so you know, at the end of this Bible study, I'm going to be making a call for the formation of the Lutheran Church Rast Synod. But I'm already told my wife she won't join. So anyway, she says, you're on your own, pal, which is probably the right thing to say. You get my point, though. You have the freedom to do this stuff. And back in Europe, you did not. So Lutherans in America explored that blessing, incredible blessing of freedom, to its fullest. But then what it also means is there's a lot of complexity and a lot of dynamic and shifting relationships. They're always in play. And that's what we're going to try and make sense out of over the next several weeks. All right, where did I put my clicker? See, everything works fine until I lose the clicker. There we are. All right, so again, things kind of move north. And as things move north after 1825, Fort Wayne is at the center of everything. If you drive up Wells Street to the north side, right by what's now Headwaters Church, used to be the YWCA, I think, there's a plaque. Have you seen it? It says the Fort Dearborn Fort Wayne Trail. That was the connection between old Fort Wayne and Chicago. Fort Wayne was crucial in this kind of transportation system. More importantly, there's another plaque down on Jefferson Boulevard. So if you head west after church this morning, go to church first, and you head down by Lutheran Hospital, right by Engle Road, just west of Engle Road at the stoplight on the south side of Jefferson, there's a plaque, and it says, "The Glorious Gate." That sounds spectacular. Now, anybody who's been at Engle Road in Jefferson knows there's nothing glorious about it at all. But this was the glorious gate. To what? The west. This was the gateway to the west. One of them, of course, St. Louis was another, right at the same time. But for Fort Wayne, what was the key? It's the portage, the portage between the Great Lakes system and the Gulf system, between the Maumee and the Wabash. And the little river there, that swampy area, just as you're going south on I-69, you go down that little hill, and there's Eagle Swamp or something like that, and Fox Island. It's a swamp. All right. There's that little low spot before you get down to the Airport Expressway, and that's the Glorious Gate. That's the portage. And because of that, all the Native Americans for hundreds of years were coming through here. And when the Europeans came in, they came through here. And then, later on, when they said we have to regularize this, because sometimes the river's higher and sometimes the river's lower, they said we're going to build a canal. And so in the 1830s, they began building the Wabash and Erie Canal, which ultimately stretched from here to the east to Junction, Ohio, and then connected to the Miami and Erie Canal up to Toledo. But then from Fort Wayne through Lafayette, Terre Haute, down to Evansville, and connected to the Ohio River ultimately. The longest canal in America was the Wabash and Erie. And the high point was Fort Wayne. And that's why we are the Summit City. That's right. Excellent. My students don't know any of it. They're always like, the Summit City, we're looking for a summit. We can't find a summit anywhere. And the high point of the Summit City is up at just north of the seminary at Old Robeson Park. And there's a ditch that runs along the east side of the seminary property, and on the south entrance, you cross that ditch, and it keeps going down. That's the old feeder canal for the Wabash and Erie. So the summit of the summit, I always say, is the seminary. That's my story, and I'm sticking with it. But when you begin building a canal like that, guess what it does? It draws even more immigrants. To do what? Dig the canal. Cornelia? Oh, there you are.
It's not that important.
There you go.
I guess it is. But wasn't it only operational for 1 year before it went bankrupt?
No, it was several years, but it wasn't real long. My point is, with the canal, it draws all the people here for the construction. And the section here actually was operational for quite some time. Canals kind of sometimes worked in sections. And the farther south you got in the state, the less regular they were in terms of their operation. So, but going here up to Toledo, it was a long-term proposition. And the same thing was true of the Miami and Erie over in western Ohio. It stayed operational for a long, long time. In fact, since you brought it up, one of the first, there were a series of 3 meetings previous to the formation of the Missouri Synod. One occurred in Cleveland in 1845, September. The second occurred in Fort Wayne in May of 1846, and drew together a bunch of people from other states, right, Missouri, Ohio, and other states, and they met together for the first time in Junction, Ohio. And they met there because of the canal. Now, how many of you have been to beautiful Junction, Ohio, the scenic garden spot of northwest Ohio? If you have, I'm worried about you, so I'm glad you haven't. It's just a little dinky town, but you can see the actual spot where the 2 canals met. And there's a marker there as well. And this is where the folks from St. Louis, they came up from the south on that canal, and the folks from Fort Wayne went out to meet them, and then they all rode the canal boat back to Fort Wayne. So, I mean, funny little things like that, but transportation stuff plays a huge role then in the formation of Not only congregations here in the Fort Wayne area, but also in the formation of our Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. We are so far behind. I wish you all would quit talking. You can't see this very well, but I think I did put it on. No, I didn't put it on. I'm sorry. This is just to give you an idea. There is an entire literature that develops enticing Germans, and I use that word very, very broadly, but enticing folks that are thinking about immigration to come to America, and they actually print up these maps then that tell people how to do it. They print up pamphlets saying, where should you go? That kind of thing. And Fort Wayne, of course, is one of the places you should go to. Illinois, Northern Ohio, places like that. And so folks start coming in, and they come in huge numbers. And as they come in, sometimes you have kind of the spectacular stories, and we'll share some down the road, of groups of people that experience persecution back in the German states, and they say, that's it, no more, we have to leave. And so they'll come in kind of bigger groups, 600, 700, 1,000, that kind of thing. But most come as what? Individuals or families. And as they come in, now think about this. Have any of you made this huge trek? I know Cornelia has, on several occasions in her life, to Botswana and then to Fort Wayne, and we won't ask her which she prefers. But have any of you made that kind of big move? You know, for us as a family, our big move was from Chicago, after Amy and I were first married, and then came through the seminary to Fort Wayne. That was a big move for us, but not that big, you know. And then we moved to Nashville, Tennessee, and that was a different world. Right? It was great, but it was a different world. But it wasn't, we made the drive in half a day, or 3/4 of a day. It's not that big a deal. Imagine you're pulling up stakes, leaving everything, your family, and coming to America, typically with the expectation you're never going back. And you will therefore never see your family again. What is it that's enough to either push somebody out of where they live, or pull them, or probably a little bit of both, to a new place? All right? It's a huge move. It's a huge move. And what draws, frankly, most of these German immigrants to America is economic opportunity. Because their options in wherever they're living in Germany are extremely limited. And America offers freedom. Not only political freedom, right? You can participate, if you're a white man, in the political process, but it also offers, perhaps more importantly, I think for most folks, economic opportunity and freedom. And folks start flooding in. They come in. And the hardship they experience is incredible. Friedrich Wenniken, whom we'll talk about here in just a second. Well, let me put this up just so you can see. Friedrich Wenniken writes about this in 1841 in a book. Short title is The Notruf, The Emergency Call. Translated into German, the longer title is The Distress of the German Lutherans in North America. And it's published, back east in here in the United States, but then scattered around in the German states as well. And it describes the experiences of the German immigrants here in America. Now, throughout this little booklet, Wenniken is constantly talking about the frontier. Now, when I use that word, what pops into your mind? The West, right? Exactly, Fort Wayne. Because Fort Wayne is the West. I tend to think of Wyoming, or something like that. But it actually means, the West actually means the frontier line, which is right at Fort Wayne in the 1830s. And folks come out here, and it is a free-for-all. And it is an absolutely fascinating place. And Wenniken experiences that, and then writes back to Germany. He's from Germany. and writes back to Germany and says, here's what it's like. And it's some ways very heart-wrenching to read, just how difficult it is to scratch out a living here at this point in time. Because, as he says, the only thing there is in northern Indiana, northwestern Ohio, southern Michigan, woods, forest, the primeval forest. You can't see, if you're going down a path, you can't see 100 yards on either side of you. And the sun doesn't penetrate the canopy. It's dark all the time in these forests. It's terrible. It's depressing. Who would want to live here? Well, there's a lot of people that want to live here because things are rough enough in Germany that even this is a better opportunity. But they have to cut down these giant trees, build their log cabins, and basically scrape by as best they can. You can clear, if you're one farmer yourself, maybe 2 acres a year. If you have a particularly heavily forested area, it's hard. It's hard. Then add to that what? And Wenniken describes this. There are no churches and no pastors. So people aren't receiving any meaningful spiritual care. But if they are, well, we'll get to that in a second. A couple other figures that we'll try and touch on. Wilhelm Lei and August Kramer yet this morning, and then we'll get to the Saxon immigration down the pike a little bit. But as we transition, here's Wenniken shortly after his ordination in the late 1830s, and then a little later on as the rugged frontier pastor. He's kind of one of these fighting preacher types. He's tough as nails. And maybe you've heard the story. He is he's frugal. And later on, after he marries Sophie Buch, she's always trying to dress him better, and he won't do it. And he has this... Exactly. She wants to dress him better, and he won't do it. And he wears these terrible yellow pants. You know the story of the yellow pants. They're really heavy, good for riding a horse. He loves them. She hates them, right? And she finally tricks him into, we'll just measure you for a new suit. And you try the thing on. Don't worry about the yellow pants. Gets him into the suit, and she runs off with the pants somewhere else, burns them. I shouldn't. But it's a challenging setting, and Wenniken steps into it. And immediately, from his arrival in America, he experiences this new setting. So he comes in, student of theology, candidate for the ministry, had been a Latin tutor for a wealthy family. He's a brilliant guy. But as often is the case, there's a big gap between finishing your preparation for the ministry and actually getting into the ministry in the German churches at this point in time. 3, 5, 7 years you might wait before you actually get a call. And so in that interim period, after he tutors for a little bit, he says, you know what, maybe I'll go to America and do some mission work. That could be interesting for a few years. And so he does. And in the summer of 1838, as a young man, 28 years old, he comes in to Baltimore, Maryland, and hops off the boat. Baltimore's a Lutheran town. I mean, not only a Lutheran town, but there's lots of Lutheran churches there. He doesn't know a thing about his circumstances. So he's looking around, what do I do? Well, he's wearing kind of a clergy outfit. And he bumps into a guy wearing a similar kind of coat that a pastor would have worn at that point in time. And he says to him, first off, do you speak German? The guy does. And then secondly, he says, are you a Lutheran? And the guy says, yeah. He's not. He's a German Methodist, German-speaking Methodist. Probably had some background in Lutheranism at some point in time, and this pastor says to him, why don't you come to church on Sunday and see how we do things here in America? So Wenniken's, okay, sounds good. He's kind of deer in the headlights at this point in time, has no clue. Goes to church, and years later he's asked, what did you think of this, the experience you had? Because it's a revivalistic Methodist community. And they're having a hootenanny on that particular Sunday. And Wenniken, as a good staid German, went into shock, as you might imagine. And so years later he was asked, what did you think when you experienced this? He said, well, I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew it wasn't Lutheran. So he kind of, well, I guess I need to ask more questions here in America, even of German-speaking people. Because he's thinking what? You're either Lutheran or you're German Reformed. But no, not in America. You can be anything. You can be anything. So his first experience here in America kind of wises him up. So then he connects with the old Pennsylvania Synod, and they say, why don't you be a missionary out west where all the Germans are going? And he says, sure. So they sponsor him, and they say, head out to the frontier, Fort Wayne, Indiana. So he does, and he takes this kind of weird path up through Maryland and then across to Pittsburgh, Zelienople, which is just north of Pittsburgh, where there's a cadre of Lutherans, and then prepares to go west. Being a typical man, he does not ask for directions. He just goes west, right? And so it takes him longer than it should have. And he has all sorts of adventures on the way, but he finally comes into Fort Wayne, right? And he's excited. I'm a missionary, you know, there are these rumors of established congregations. This is going to be great. And so he comes in, and he immediately comes into contact with the leadership of the Lutheran Church and Reformed Church. It's a union church here in Fort Wayne, namely St. Paul. St. Paul here, just east of us. St. Paul had been founded in 1837 as a congregation, formally speaking, and their first pastor, Jesse Hoover, usually spelled Hoover, but might have been Huber, an anglicized to that. He had died the previous May. So May of 1838, he had died, and Wenniken shows up in Fort Wayne in September of 1838, all right? And immediately the congregation does what? I mean, they clamp onto him like you wouldn't believe, because here's a pastor, right? And we might not get one for some time, because our pastor just died. So, I mean, their hooks are into this guy. And they say, you have to be our pastor. And he says, I can't, I'm a missionary. Well, it doesn't take long before the word gets down to Zion and Friedheim, right? In Adams County. And they say, we need you to be our pastor too. And Wenniken's, I told the St. Paul folks that I'm a missionary and I'm being supported by the Pennsylvania Ministerium to travel around. They say, no, you got to be our pastor. He says, all right, here's what we'll do. I've got to fulfill my missionary duties. We'll talk again when I'm back. So in September and October of 1838, he goes on a missionary tour. He goes up through northwestern Ohio to Monroe, Michigan, on the lake. Then he cuts across, I should be going this way for you. He cuts across from Monroe to Niles, Michigan. Goes to a Notre Dame football game. No, he doesn't. That's a dumb joke. Heads down south to around Crawfordsville. Just west of Crawfordsville was the oldest Lutheran church in Indiana, established in 1828, called Phanuel Lutheran Church by a group of folks, Germans, that had moved from North Carolina en masse to Crawfordsville. So he visits that church. And then he comes back up the Wabash to Fort Wayne. As I said, it takes about 6 weeks or so in September, October 1838. And he comes back in a lot of ways a changed person, because his experience that he has repeatedly is of these scattered immigrant families, small communities that have no pastor, no congregation, no spiritual care at all. Their children aren't baptized. The children aren't confirmed. They don't have the Lord's Supper. They're just not receiving any spiritual care at all. And if they are receiving spiritual care, it's typically from a revivalist Methodist, which he's already had a bad experience with. And for him, in some ways, that's worse than no care at all. Just this emotional, and this is the age of the huge emotional religious revivals, where people are, literally, this is how they describe themselves: barking, shaking, rolling, laughing. It's at the big one at Cane Ridge, Kentucky in 1801, there's about 25,000 people. And they said you didn't need directions to find it, you just followed the noise. So Wenniken says, all right, we could complain about this or we can do something. And so what he does is to write back east to the Pennsylvania Ministerium, send us help. We have more people than you can imagine out here. And they're not being cared for or cared for poorly. And when that doesn't get the response he wants, he does what? He writes back to Germany. Says, you all need to help us. And when that isn't immediately forthcoming, in 1841 he actually travels back to Germany and goes on a speaking tour to try and drum up interest for service here in America. And it's enormously successful. He's a very compelling speaker. Later on, they would, when they talked about our first two presidents in the Missouri Synod, the first one was C.F.W. Walther, and the second one was Wenniken. And they would say, when Walther spoke, it was like a rain shower watering the earth, and beautiful. And when Wenniken spoke, it was like last night at 3 a.m. Storm, thunder, lightning, boom. I mean, he said, this is urgent. We've got to go now. You all need to come over here and help us. Come over and help us. Just like the Macedonian cry in the book of Acts. Come over and help us. And folks begin to respond, much to their credit. The situation is also driven by his experience in bumping into some of the pastors that are already at work in the West. And this is one of the great ones. Ezra Keller is a student of our friend from last week, Samuel Simon Schmucker. And he is one of these people who said, the old Lutheran stuff, it's got to go. We've got to come up with something new. We can do better. And we must. And so in his biography, his autobiography, this is hard to read, but I'm going to try. He tells the story of what might actually be his initial interaction with Wenniken. Although he doesn't name him as such, he gives a different name, but it very well could be Wenniken. And he says, I'll just read a little bit here from that. I came to Fort Wayne to attend the meeting of the Synod of the West as a delegate from the Synod of Ohio, with Reverend Ritz as my colleague. The special object of our mission was to endeavor to effect a union between the two bodies and establishment of an institution. He eventually started Wittenberg College in Springfield, Ohio. He's the first president. Met a number of my former fellow students. He was a graduate of Gettysburg and under Schmucker. And then he said, it was a matter of regret to me to find so many of our American brethren absent, while those from our fatherland were nearly all present. Now, this little statement tells you the change. The Americans aren't there. They aren't showing up. But suddenly, you have more and more, even though they're just a handful at this point, of pastors who've come from Germany. And these guys, he doesn't like. I met the Reverend J. Wagner, as he puts it here, it's probably Wenniken, who is destined in great measure to control the European element in this region. He is an accomplished gentleman and an ardent Christian, but a fanatical dogmatist. He possesses considerable talent, has a good education, is a man sound in integrity and great energy of character, but he is quite antiquated in his views of Christian doctrine and church polity. So here's what he believes is antiquated. He considers subscription to the unaltered Augsburg Confession, without note or comment, as indispensable to constitute a man a Lutheran. The Lutheran Church, based on the Augsburg Confession, he considers the Apostolical Catholic Church. He believes in baptismal regeneration, that baptism forgives sins, and the real presence of the body and blood of Christ in the Lord's Supper. He recommends private confession and absolution, makes the sign of the cross in the administration of the ordinance of baptism, and conforms to the various forms of the symbolists. Now, this is 19th century speak, I understand. But what he just did was go through all of the points of Schmucker that we talked about last week. Did you hear it? Yeah, I mean, he hit them all, especially baptism and the Lord's Supper. Baptism for him as a Lutheran pastor and soon to be president of a college, does not forgive sins. Christ is not present in the sacrament of the altar for Ezra Keller. And that, for him, is what Lutheranism is actually about. What he wants to avoid is are the antiquated views of a person like Wenniken. So you can see we're setting up for what? I know it's hard to believe. Conflict between Lutherans. This is, I mean, none of us have ever experienced this, and it's, you know, you have to use your, but that's, I should have moved that forward, sorry, not that you could read it anyway. That's what he's bumping into, and that's kind of the, you know, that's some of the resistance that he's experiencing. So this sets up for a fight, and the fight goes on until 2022. And we'll keep going. There's Wenniken again. One of the things he does when he goes to Germany in that period from 1841 to 43 is come into contact with a Lutheran pastor by the name of Wilhelm Lei. And he says to Lei, I'm not getting any help out of the churches back east. Can you help? Prepare men for service in America. And Lei begins to do it. As a pastor in a congregation, he actually starts training, has more or less a one-year program. Could be a little longer, could even be a little shorter, depending on the candidate, in which he, as pastor again, prepares men very quickly for service in America. And then sends them over and says, go to an existing seminary and finish out your education. You know, we'll get this ball rolling, and then you finish it out. And the idea he has is to send them to the Ohio Synod's Seminary in Columbus, Ohio. That's the idea. But even as that's developing, a huge controversy emerges in the Ohio Synod. The big issue is, are the students going to be taught in German or in English? We're already getting there. And when the Ohio Synod says English only, then that's no longer an option for Lei and his colleagues. They have to do something else. What is it you think that they might do? Maybe start a seminary in Fort Wayne. Before that happens, however, or as it's happening, maybe it's a better way of putting it, Wenniken goes back east, and he serves Second Lutheran Church in Baltimore. And here, just very briefly, I'm telling too many stories, but he says, my gift is not teaching. He's already tried training a couple of guys in this parsonage, and he says, not my gift. I'm a better missionary, I'm a better connector. I can get people connected with one another, so we'll work on that. And what better place to do it than from the point when the immigrants come in? And Baltimore, he knows it, so he goes back to Baltimore and serves as pastor. And here, as pastor, he organizes his congregation so that every time a boat's coming in with immigrants, the congregation meets them. And the way it plays out, this will sound all too familiar, is the men go down to the docks, and the women cook a meal. And the men go down to the docks, and as the immigrants are going off, they're holding up signs, in German, of course, that say, free breakfast. And the Germans get to the word free, and they're in, right? No, they see this, and okay, so they come over to the church, and there, Wenniken connects them, you know, where are you headed? Well, I'm headed to Zanesville, Ohio. Okay, there's a congregation out there. Let me write you a letter of introduction to the pastor that I know, because he's been riding around all over Ohio, Indiana, Michigan. Or if there's not a congregation in that area, he makes a note of it, and then gives the assignment to one of these traveling preachers to make sure they go to the area where these folks are so they can start a congregation. It's brilliant, isn't it? Because at what point are people at most risk from leaving the church? When they leave their home, when they leave their church home. And so here they are coming in completely detached, and Wenniken attaches them to a community that's gathered around the Word and the sacraments. Isn't that something? Now, I'm too late. I'll do the other two things more quickly. But I'm going to tell this story right now because this hits home directly with me. My great-grandfather, Emil Rast, came to America in 1894. May of 1894. And he was deserting the Russian army. And I have more and more respect for him every day, but that's another man. But that meant because he was AWOL, he could never go back. He knew he was never going back. Never saw his brothers, his siblings, his parents again. And he knew that was going to be the case unless they came over here. And believe me, they weren't going to come over here. So he made that cut, that break, came to the United States, hits the shores. He was a member of the church, kind of a, do what you have to do guy, back in what was Middle Poland at the time, old South Prussia. And so when he came to America, it was not for religious reasons at all. But when he got off the boat in New York City in 1894, he was met by a missionary pastor of the Missouri Synod who said to him, "Where are you headed?" "Well, I'm going to Terryville, Connecticut, because there are all these people from my area that have moved to Terryville." And the missionary, whose name I don't know, I could probably find it out, said to him, "Great, we have a congregation in Bristol, Connecticut, Emmanuel in Bristol. Let me write you an introduction to Otto Diesel, the pastor, and he will help you get settled once you make the trek up to northwestern Connecticut." And so he did, and he was immediately connected to the church. About a year later, a woman who, back in Middle Poland, lived about 20 miles away from where he did, but they had never met. It was on the other side of the Vistula River. She is deserting an arranged marriage. Hops on the boat, comes to New York, and says, there are people from my area that have gone to Terryville, Connecticut. Let me write you an introduction to Otto Diesel, who's the pastor at Emmanuel in Bristol. And she goes up to Emmanuel in Bristol, and my great-grandparents meet. I'm here because of that missionary. Thank God for his faithfulness. So this is very personal for me. People will say, "Oh, it's the immigrants. They were all coming in. Of course they got connected." No, they didn't. Remember that picture from earlier? No congregations in Kentucky and Tennessee. We didn't follow them. We didn't connect them to congregations, the folks who moved west in the old Southwest. But in the Northwest, you saw all those congregations in Ann Arbor and Fort Wayne and Cleveland, Chicago, Milwaukee, of course, later on St. Louis. We kept people connected to the means of grace, and God worked through it. Huge blessing, and for me, obviously, a very personal one. So thank God for these faithful workers and the work that they did. Wenniken would go on to be, as I mentioned, the second president of the LCMS, elected in 1850, and then finished out. He came back. He got sick of being Synod president and moved to Adams County. Some of you are part of the Wenniken House Project. And then later on served in Cleveland, Ohio, and he's actually, though he died in San Francisco, he's buried in Cleveland. So we should have a field trip to his grave. On a nice day like yesterday, it would be perfect, wouldn't it? I'll take you to all the graves in Cleveland, Lutheran graves. It's very exciting. But he knows his gift isn't teaching, so he hands the ball over to one of the people that Leah has helped prepare, Wilhelm Lei. Lei has come to the United States in the early 1840s. He's first called to be a pastor in Pomeroy, Ohio. That's right. Nobody knows where Pomeroy is. It's close to Parkersburg, West Virginia, which nobody knows where that is either. But it's a little place down on the Ohio River. Serves there briefly, and then is the hand-chosen successor to Wenniken at St. Paul with the purpose of establishing a seminary. And so Sealer starts what is today Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne in October of 1846. And he is one tough dude as well. I mean, he is tough as nails. And the story I always tell my students is about his lack of tact with respect to his wife. When he arrives in northeastern Indiana, he is a bachelor, 44 years old. And the elders at St. Paul say, "You should get married, Pastor." And he says, "Okay. You have anybody in mind?" And one of the people has a connection to family down in around Marysville, Ohio, and says, yeah, I have a friend, a family member whose daughter is getting a little old, so maybe you'd be interested in her. And he says, fine, we'll have a look. So they ride down to Marysville, and she's out in the field working, and he says, she'll do it, and they get married the next day. It's called romance, right? Romance. And she is an incredible support to him and to our seminary. So she's 16 when he meets her. Old. And shortly thereafter, moves up here to Fort Wayne. They start the seminary out, and she becomes responsible in a lot of ways for the well-being of the students. In October 1846, there are 11 students, and this teenager, newly married, has to take care of the boys, most of whom are older than her, of course. And she does it, and well, and continues in that role. Sealer himself says in one really, it's just terrible. He says of Susanna Kern Sealer, she would never inspire an artist. Isn't that, I mean, but look at him. But thank God for her faithfulness. I think it's the middle one. I think that they have on the right by the stairs to the pulpit at St. Paul. So right before you preach at St. Paul, that's what greets you. You know, the peace of the Lord be with you always. Okay. Anyway, he does great work. He serves as president from 1861 to and professor from 1846 to 1861, 15 years. Then the synod decides to move the seminary from Fort Wayne to St. Louis, and they work conjointly. I'm just going to skip this one real for the sake of time, as interesting as another map is, and that too. There's the first, the cabin on the left is the first seminary building. The addition is built in 1848. It's the site of the original seminary is today Indiana Tech. And if you go down there, the 1857 building is, of course, still standing. So you can go see that building. They remodeled it about, 12, 13 years ago, something like that. Fascinating to see. But in 1861, the Synod unites the two seminaries. They operate discreetly from one another, but they occupy the same building. There it is on South Jefferson in 1875. But that same year, in 1875, the seminary moves to Springfield, Illinois. And the old building was called the Coffee Mill, the Café Mill, because it looks like one of those grinders. It reminded people of one of those grinders. It was there till about 1930. They tore it down. Luther Hall was there. Which one's this? Oh, the Castle Gardens was one of the dormitories there. And then, of course, the famous sheep stable. This was a temporary building where they put the students up. The students hated it. Hey, you should be thankful for this new building. They named it the sheep stable. So students never change. And there's the overall campus. In so our seminary moved to Springfield in 1875. It remained there until 1976 with the transition between the senior college and seminary. And we've been back since 1976. So 46 years, right? My math right? 40, something like that. That's why I went into theology. Very briefly, the other really interesting part of the story at this point is this guy. And I could talk on and on about August Kramer. He's my favorite of the founders, but we don't have time. So briefly, here's a guy who's too smart for his own good. Goes off to university as a kid, really doesn't see himself, he describes himself as non-Christian, even though he's raised in a Lutheran family. But he says, I wasn't interested at all, had no interest. Goes off to university where he joins what's called a dueling society, and also then a group that is seeking the unification of Germany, and gets himself into terrible trouble by trying to overthrow the government. one of these moments where his buddies say, "You go first, we'll be right behind you." And so, and he goes, and he ends up being arrested, spends 6 years in prison from 1833 to 1839. And in that 6-year period in prison, he becomes a Christian. He has a lot of time on his hands and reads the Bible a lot and is exposed to the Lutheran confessions, becomes a convinced Lutheran. But when he comes out, he says, I don't have any options really here in America, in Germany, because I'd like to be a pastor, but I can't be, because in order to be assigned as a pastor, you have to have the support of the state, and he tried to overthrow the state. So it doesn't look very hopeful. So he goes back to the college and takes a degree in philology and discovers that he has a gift for languages. He can learn any language you throw at him quickly. So he learns all these languages. He already knew Latin. He learns Hebrew. He learns French very well. Becomes a very adept English speaker, and a bunch of others as well. And to make a rather long story short, ends up teaching at Oxford University in England. He's brilliant. So Seeler's a brilliant guy. Kramer's probably more brilliant. I mean, he's just off the charts. Brilliant. And serving there, he ends up, basically they tell him, if you don't do something dumb like try and overthrow the state, you'll be a professor here for the remainder of your career, which is a great career. And he quits. Now, part of the reason is there's a movement going on at Oxford University that rejects the Reformation at this point in time, and he's a convinced Lutheran. So he says, that's no good. But more importantly, he's heard the call from Wenniken via Lei to come to America and be a pastor. And he says, I could do that in America. I can't do it in Germany, but I could do it in America. So Lei puts together this scheme saying, we're going to start colonies in Michigan. And what we'll do, we're going to have a twofold purpose. We're going to try and gather together the scattered Germans into congregations, and we're also going to do outreach to the Native Americans. But to do that, we need someone who can learn Ojibwa, Chippewa. And Kramer says, I can do that. And so he leads a group of folks from Franconia to the Thumb area of Michigan in 1845 and establishes the colony of Frankenmuth. And the first thing they open is a chicken restaurant. No. The first thing they do is establish their congregation. And it's named, perhaps you've been there if you've been to Frankenmuth, St. Lawrence. Yeah, it's the best named congregation in the Missouri Synod. I may be a bit biased. But they established the congregation, and then in short order, you see there are several other. 1847, Frankentrost is founded, and then the others in the years following. When he begins his ministry, he first off is responsible for the established congregation, St. Lawrence, but he immediately begins outreach among the Chippewa Indians. But to do that, he needs some kind of tool to teach the faith. What do you think he does? He creates a written form of the language and then translates Luther's small catechism. So not only did Campanius do it back in the 1640s, now Kramer does it again. He's then assisted in this regard by a pastor named Edward Byerline, a missionary named Edward Byerline, and the two of them together work on this Chippewa version of Luther's Small Catechism, the handwritten version of which we have in our archives at the seminary, which is extremely cool. Later on, when he's sent over by Lei says, be sure you join Lutheran Synod, and so he joins the Michigan Synod, but very quickly learns it's kind of the Ezra Keller variety, not very Lutheran, so he quits. And thus, in the year 1845, you end up with these incredibly gifted people scattered. Baltimore, Wenniken, right? Seeler in Fort Wayne, and Kramer up in Frankenmuth, with sizable communities that have grown up around them and emerging institutions, but all of whom are independent from one another. They might have ties, but they're all independent. And the question becomes, can we do more if we get together? And the obvious answer to that is, duh. Yeah, but you need one more piece in order to make that happen. And that, of course, is going to be the Saxons, who are down in St. Louis in Perry County. So that's where we'll leave off at this point. I talked way too much. Are there any questions very briefly? Pastor's going to kill me. It's 10:19. I'm all right. Yes, please. Here's a microphone for you.
Oh, here. You're kidding.
Go for it.
I can't help but wonder, when you were talking about people immigrating from all over, okay? And like back east in New York area, didn't they have to go to Ellis Island?
Not originally, not initially. Nope. I mean, you'd have the ship come in, say in the Baltimore Harbor, and the captain of the ship had to declare his cargo, which included the passengers. And they'd then receive clearance from the authorities there, wherever they were, either New York or Baltimore, or Philadelphia, wherever the case might be. And then they'd just be, off they go. Oh. It was very easy to
I wish we still had that.
Any other questions? Very good. Thank you. Oh, you don't need to do that.
You're in 2 weeks.
2 weeks.